Before I start today's lecture, I wanted to make a comment. At the beginning of my talk yesterday, I gave a little bit about my background and where I got my degrees and so forth. I forgot to tell you one thing, and that is that it's always tough. Can you hear it back there now? Can we turn it up a bit? That's better? Okay. It's always tough for me to come on these cruises, particularly where I'm gone for a month, because I have a 4-year-old at home. And, when I look around the room on this age cohort, I don't think that many of you have 4-year-olds at home, but you may remember back that when you maybe had kids, or perhaps today you have grandkids, at that age they grow up pretty quick. And so when I'm gone for a month, they grow up real fast. Now, when I've mentioned this on previous lectures, people have said, well, do you have any pictures? Because I'm willing to bet that many of you will have at least pictures of your grandkids on your cell phone these days, and you can show people your grandkids' pictures. And so this time I did bring a couple of pictures. Here he is when he was about only 6 weeks old. Now, I know what the gentlemen were thinking here when I said that. They're thinking, what kind of prescription was he using? He's a little bit older now. He's a Lusitano, and hopefully there is a Andalusian horse show, which is a Spanish breed of horses, when we're in Punta Arenas, and I hopefully am going on that as an escort, so maybe see that. Okay. Today's lecture titled A Man, a Plan, a Canal, Panama. And frankly, that isn't a unique title to me. Many people who give this kind of lecture on cruise ships, or there's actually, I think, a PBS video with this same title. Anybody know why we use that particular title? Yeah, it's a palindrome. It reads the same way forward and backward. In fact, it's one of the longer palindromes. A palindrome is a phrase that reads the same way forward and reverse. You can forget things like capitalization and punctuation and things like that. And there was another one just recently. Anybody remember what happened recently? February 22nd, 2022. That's a palindrome. As long as you use the European way with the day of the month before the month, it works out fairly well. I'm going to start this lecture way long time ago, back in the 1400s, with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. These were two essentially royal families that got together, Castile and Aragon, and began the uniting of Spain. During their reign, they ended what we refer to as the reconquest of Spain. Spain had been conquered by the Islamic forces in 711 AD, and the Islamic people's military expanded all the way into central France in the first few years. They were defeated in 732 AD near Paris, and from then on, the Christians had what they called the Reconquest, the Reconquista. And that Reconquista ends with the 1492 conquest of Granada. There's Ferdinand and Isabella. They were teenagers when they got married. Within the first few days, they issued an order that expelled any non-Christians in Spain. That meant the Moors, or the Islamic peoples, as well as Jews. So they had to leave or become Christians. And if they became Christians, they were what referred to as conversos, converted ones. And some of those converted ones actually continued to practice their previous religion. And as a result, we have something called the Inquisition in Spain. When we're in Cartagena, one of the things that you may do on a tour is visit the House of the Inquisition. There was one in Cartagena. So for the first time in many years, Spain was essentially peaceful, and they began their age of discovery. The Portuguese had begun their discoveries decades earlier. So they can go focus in on the other parts of the world. 1492, just one day after the Jews left the port of Cadiz in southern Spain, Columbus set sail from a nearby town of Palos. And then we have the 4 voyages of Columbus, etc. I'm not going to talk about the exploration and settlement of the Caribbean. I have another lecture that will do that, but we're talking here today about Panama, and this guy is important for our story, Vasco Núñez de Balboa. He was born in a small town, actually, if you see the name there, Jerez de los Caballeros. When it has the name Caballeros, means that one of the knightly groups that were part of the Reconquest probably settled there. In this case, it was the Knights Templar that were in his hometown. It's only about 20 miles away from the Portuguese border in far southwestern Extremadura. The name of that area in Spain, Extremadura, means in English extremely hard. It was one of the poorest parts of Spain. It still is today. And Balboa was the third son. In Spanish rules in those days, the first son inherits everything. The second son probably becomes a priest, and the third guy is sort of a spare. It's sort of like the English, an heir and a spare. But he has no great future there, so very early in the conquest period in the Caribbean, he goes to the New World. We don't know exactly when he gets there, but somewhere around 1500. There were a couple of voyages with groups of settlers before that, but he's one of the very, very early settlers into the Caribbean. We don't actually have a good picture of him. Nobody took a photograph of him for some reason. But he participated in an exploration along the coast of Venezuela and got some things like pearls and gold out of that. So he became a fairly wealthy man with his share of that particular voyage in 1501. And he used his money to buy some land on the island of Hispaniola, which was the main settlement area at that point in time. And he became a farmer, an unsuccessful farmer. He went bankrupt. And his creditors went after him, and he joined an expedition going to what is today Colombia, near Cartagena. They were going to set up the first settlement on the mainland. There are stories that says he hid away in a barrel from his creditors to get on the ship for that particular voyage. But in 1508, he settles or heads off towards Colombia. That was not successful, and they were defeated by the local Indians, and the survivors had to flee, head out to sea. They actually headed to the west, and if you go west from the area around Cartagena, what you do is bump into Panama. And so he was a settler in the first settlement in what is today Panama, a little town called Santa Maria la Antigua. And I'll show you where that is in a map. He was quickly selected as the head guy. There were just a small group of survivors. There was a small Indian town there that was able to help feed them. So here's where Santa Maria is. It's on the far, far eastern end of Panama today. In fact, I've never been there, but supposedly if you're coming from Colombia by boat, there are no roads out there. If you're coming by boat, it's the first town that you would hit in Panama from the Colombian border, but a nothing place these days. At the same time as that expedition was going off to found the first town supposedly in Colombia, the King of Spain had appointed a man by the name of Nicosa as the governor of an area called Veragua, which Veragua was the name that they were using for the territory from modern Panama all the way up to Honduras, the area along the coast of Costa Rica and Nicaragua and a little bit of what is today Honduras. So Nicosa goes out there exploring, and the local Indians attack them, and most of the men are either killed or wounded, and so he has to flee, Nicosa has to flee back to this place, Santa Maria la Antigua, where Balboa had settled. So he heads off to be where Balboa is. He arrives off Santa Maria, and Balboa and the people there will not let him land. This guy is supposedly the governor, but they won't let him land. So Nicosa, with 18 men, have to sail off, hopefully towards Santo Domingo, and they're never seen again. Which means now Balboa is completely in charge, and he becomes the governor of the area of Panama, or at least what is Veragua in those days. So Balboa is going off exploring. He makes a series of expeditions to the south and east of Santa Maria, which is today modern Colombia. They find gold, they find local natives that they can enslave. In September of 1513, he has another expedition, this time heading virtually south and west rather than south and east, and they cross the Isthmus of Panama. And along the way, they pick up local Indians. They have a number of battles. They find various things like gold and other valuable products. On September 25th, he first sees what is a new place, the South Sea. And this is Balboa supposedly on the top of a hill seeing what is today the Pacific Ocean. 4 days later, he is actually down there and goes in the water and claims the whole Pacific Ocean for Spain. And on the way back to Santa Maria la Antigua, they're going back with a lot of gold, with Indians, they picked up cotton cloth that the local people were making. So he returns to Santa Maria, and they send off the first load of goods, which is basically gold and things like that, valuable stuff, off to Spain for the royal fifth. Always Spain got 1/5 of whatever you found. The king got 1/5. And they tell Spain about this new ocean that they've found. A new man is appointed as governor of Veragua, a man by the name of Pedro Arias, or simply refer to him as Pedrarias. He arrives with a whole group of people, 1,500 Spaniards, to take over this settlement, and they replace Balboa as the local governor. There's, again, an imaginary picture of what Pedrarias looks like. So he replaces Balboa as governor. Balboa is arrested. He's for usurping the role of governor, but no big penalty or anything like that. And for a couple of years, he leads more explorations, particularly to the west in Panama, to what is today western part of Panama. He does a number of different things. He marries Pedrarias' daughter. Amazingly enough, she's in Spain and he's in Panama. So the marriage apparently was not consummated, but Pedrarias is now his father-in-law. And in 1519, he led another expedition to the coast of Panama, the Pacific side. They built some ships and they started to explore the islands in the Gulf of Panama that we'll be seeing in a few days. On the way back to Santa Maria, he's arrested by a guy that you may have heard of, Francisco Pizarro. And if I was telling the story more about Peru on this ship, we'd talk a lot about Pizarro, but he's sort of a minor character in this story. He's arrested, he's taken back to Santa Maria, and he denies that he was going to set up an independent kingdom and do exploring there in the Pacific, but he is in fact convicted, and he's sentenced to death. And here we see poor Balboa having his head chopped off in Santa Maria. I have to tell you, there was never a building in Santa Maria that looked anything like that. It was just a cruddy little town, but supposedly whoever did this drawing thinks that there's some sort of big monstrous building. But Balboa lost his head. A town is founded about the same time on the Pacific side, and here's a little bit of a representation of it. Within a few years, Pedrarias has established his rule in Panama. Short time, they're sending more ships out through the Pacific, and Pizarro comes into the story where they explore south and ultimately get to Peru and so forth. The town, Panama Vieja, is still existing, although it's basically an archaeological site. It's a few miles to the east of modern Panama City. And when I went on a shore excursion a little over a week ago, when we were in Panama, I was doing the shore excursion that said it was going to go to the colonial spot. I thought I was going here. No, I went to the colonial area of Panama City, and I'm not sure what's happening on this ship, but this is a spot. If you were on an independent shore excursion, you might go all the way out to Panama Vieja. It's an interesting little archaeological site. It's a little park a few miles out of town. And this is what was the tower for the cathedral there. There is a statue of Balboa that if you look carefully and if your guide points it out, you'll see it's along the parks in downtown Panama City today. If you're on one of the shore excursions, I think they included one, you'll go right past this statue. There are a couple of other important Spanish towns on the Caribbean side. During the period when gold and silver from Peru was being sent north to Panama and then across the isthmus to the Caribbean side, this town, Puerto Bello, is the most important town. And I've been over there, and also San Lorenzo was a fort, the Spanish fort at the mouth of the Chagres River, which was an important area during much of the colonial period. So we're going to skip ahead very quickly to 1849. And 1849 is important because of the gold rush in California. Everybody wants to go to California, particularly people on the east side of the United States. And how do you do it? How do you get there? You have one of four choices. You can go around the southern part of South America, around the Horn. That's a long, long trip. You can't do it certain times of the year in wintertime. So it takes a minimum of 6 or 8 months, and it's oftentimes dangerous. You could go across the Great Plains. You could only do that in the summertime. And again, it's a long, arduous, difficult trip, dangerous. You could go across Nicaragua. There was a route across Nicaragua, Central America. The problem with that route is that there were no steamship lines connecting Nicaragua to the United States, particularly to the East Coast, and also on the west side to California. Or you could go across the Isthmus of Panama. And there were, in fact, in 1849, 1850, there were established steamship routes from New York and New Orleans to Panama, and there was a shipping route with steamships from Panama up to California. So it became the preferred route. On this map, we don't see the Nicaraguan route, but I think you can see the dashed line there, which shows the Panama route as being the safest and the quickest way. It was probably also the most expensive because just crossing the isthmus was expensive. You had to go up the Chagres River. The blue line that we see there was the Chagres River, and you'd go up to a certain point, and then you had about 15 miles by horse or wagon to get to Old Panama City. This is a painting that was done in 1850 on the Chagres River of people being poled, being pushed on poles up the Chagres River during the gold rush period. In 1849, as soon as people heard about the gold rush in New York City, a railroad company was incorporated. They started construction in 1850. By 1852, they had it a little ways across the isthmus, and by 1855, they had it all the way, about 4.5 years to construct the railroad. It was the world's first transcontinental railroad. Went from one ocean to the other. Obviously short, it was only a little over 50 miles long, not anything compared to the Trans-Siberian or the railroads across the United States. But for a number of years, it was the most expensive and the most profitable railroad in the world because it was so fast and easy and made it easy to get to the West Coast. When the Central Pacific, Union Pacific was finished in the United States, that monopoly ended, but it was still a very, very busy railroad throughout the 19th century. And this is a map showing the route. It's the black line that you see there. It is not the same route that the railroad follows today because much of it is below what is today the Panama Canal. So again, let's look a few things here. This is the Panama Railroad. This is a map or a photograph from 1885 in Cologne at the Caribbean side. And this is also from Cologne. Notice here that it calls it Aspinwall. Aspinwall was one of the directors of the railroad company and also the owner of the shipping company, the steamship line on the Pacific side. And also says New Granada. This is part of Colombia, New Granada. Here's the railroad again. We jump ahead again, up to the French Canal in the 1870s, early 1880s. The French had just come off building the Suez Canal, and they decided they could build a canal easily across the isthmus. It was a shorter route than Suez, be easy to do. So they started construction in 1881 under the direction of the guy who was the director of the French Suez Canal project, a man by the name of de Lesseps. And there we see him. The equipment that they had in those days was not very good. It was just moving a small amount of dirt in terms of each bucket was fairly small. The railroad cars they were using were very small. The design that they had for a sea level canal was not very good. the death rate was very, very high from diseases like malaria and yellow fever. But here's a couple of drawings of their project, and we even have photographs from the 1880s by then. So this is one of their excavator machines, and their little railroad cars, and their cemetery. It's estimated that 22,000 people died in the French project, most of them blacks brought in from the Caribbean. These are people who were brought to the Caribbean as slaves, but by this time they were free and they could go where they wanted. They went to Panama because it was offering good salaries and good working conditions. They didn't realize how deadly it was in those days. This is a little newspaper story in 1889 when the canal went, the French project went bankrupt. Notice the headline there, it calls it the Panama Canal fiasco. Today we would call this a Ponzi scheme. The initial investors pulled out money in the first few years. They invested very little and got lots of return, 100 to 1 in profits. And those were people like de Lesseps and his family members and some of the buddies that he has. Lots and lots of French. Some authorities suggest as many as 600 to 800,000 people in France invested their life savings in this project and lost everything. It was a total disaster in France. The company, they put on a couple of people on trial, de Lesseps and one of his sons, and a guy that you may have heard of by the name of Eiffel, one of the other early investors. They were convicted. Only his son Charles went to prison. De Lesseps himself ended up in house arrest. He was an old man by this time. But they established a new company to take over the project, partly because they had a contract to build a canal, and that contract had some value, as well as the junk equipment had a little bit of value. And the maps that they made were, in fact, very important value for the United States when we got involved. I show this one. I'll use this same slide tomorrow. When we're going to the first set of locks, the Gatun locks, which are far, far left side of the slide there, we'll go underneath a big bridge, and just after that, you'll see this thing off to the right, and that's the only place where you'll see anything connected to the French project. But when you look at that, that's some construction that the French did. So look for that as we go through. And I'll point it out again tomorrow. These are some of the French equipment that was abandoned. We jump ahead again. 1898, the United States is about to declare war on Spain over some of the things that happened in the Caribbean, like the blowing up of the battleship Maine. And there was a battleship on the Pacific side of the United States, the battleship Orion, and they ordered it to sail and join the fleet in the Caribbean. And it had to sail all the way around the Horn, around southern South America. It took them something like 66 days to do that. And every time they stopped to get supplies like water and coal, messages would be telegraphed back to the United States, and people in the United States were following the voyage of the Orion. And what happened was basically that people in the United States, including members of Congress, realized that if we had had a canal through Panama, we would have saved a lot of time for the Orion getting to the Caribbean. So beginning with that voyage of the Orion, there was a lot of effort to talk about to getting a canal. I think we have a lecture coming up, and I don't remember whether Gary's doing that or Bob is doing it, but we've got at least one more lecture on the canal where they'll go into some of the politics. But basically, the United States came up with an agreement with Panama, or with Colombia, to build a canal. The United States Senate ratified the treaty. The Colombians did not. And so the United States, particularly President Roosevelt, began to figure out how could we get around that. And so in October of 2003, the Panamanians revolted. Amazingly enough, there were U.S. warships standing by. We supported that, and in only a couple days, the United States signed a treaty with the new government there. And well, again, we'll have at least one more lecture that's going to go into this a lot more detail than what I'm doing here today. Here's Roosevelt in a cartoon from a newspaper. Basically, he said, "We stole it fair and square." So the United States decided we'll build the canal. They set up what is called the ICC, the Isthmian Canal Commission, to operate and do the project. It was a group of engineers and politicians in Washington, D.C. They bought the French remains there, the leftover equipment, and particularly the maps and things like that. And they named this man, John Wallace, as the chief engineer on the project. And he went down to Panama with his family. One of the interesting stories is that they took with them 2 bronze caskets, just in case they were needed. They knew that the death rate from malaria and yellow fever was very high. He lasted only about a year. And as soon as he got to Panama, he started construction work. They began to dig the canal using the old French equipment. That didn't work out very well. So when he resigned, a new guy came over. This was a man by the name of John Stevens. Stevens was a railroad man. He had helped build the Great Northern Railroad from Minneapolis out to Seattle. And here's Stevens. He did a number of different things to ensure the project. First of all, he stopped construction. And he convinced Roosevelt that we couldn't build a sea level canal for some reasons I'll mention in a minute. He stopped all the construction on the canal and started to do the infrastructure. He realized that the railroad was in the wrong place, so he had to move the railroad to where it would be outside the limits of the canal. He started housing, water systems, things like that, the infrastructure, the warehouses and things like that. He rebuilt the Panama Canal Railroad, and he figured out how to get rid of the dirt. The French had just been digging out and piling up the dirt nearby, which wasn't going to do very much because dirt was in the way. Stevens figured out that you needed to move that dirt out of the area that the canal was going to be. And he ended up using it at both ends to build breakwaters that we'll see tomorrow or day after tomorrow or so, whenever we go through. And they also used it to build the dam at Gatun. He met with Teddy Roosevelt to argue that you could not build a sea level canal. One, it would be too much of a project to dig through the Continental Divide at a place called Culebras. Number two, you have to have locks. Even if you built today a sea level canal, you'd have to have some locks, because on the Caribbean side, there's a very low tide. It's less than a foot or so. On the Pacific side, the tide range of tide is over 10 feet. Sometimes on high tide, it can be as much as 18-foot difference between low and high tide, and you'd need to have locks to accommodate that. Number three, if you didn't have locks, you would have a tidal surge from the Pacific side that would have gone all the way through the canal, scouring out the sides of the canal and causing landslides and causing you to constantly dredge, which they still have to do anyway. So a sea level canal was basically impossible. He convinced Roosevelt of that. He recommended building a dam at Gatun, damming up the Chagres River, building a lake at roughly 85-foot elevation. And I'll point out tomorrow that it's not really 85 feet, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. And he only lasted about 2 years. There are all sorts of explanations on why Stevens resigned. Some people say he was depressed. Some people say he simply said, I don't know how to build locks. But he resigned. Later on, he shows up as one of the people that helped build the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Lots of pictures here of construction, and we'll flip through these very quickly. This is Bruce Cyrus' big steam shovel. Notice here on this picture, they're loading up a railroad car, and the railroad car has a wall on only one side, on the left-hand side. There's no wall on the right-hand side. They load dirt onto the car. When they get to the other end and want to dump it, the French were using dump cars where they had to tilt the car. Here, what they had was like a snowplow, and it was an arrangement where the car would pull in, the snowplow would come on, and would simply push off the dirt very, very quickly, very efficient way of loading or unloading the cars. Here's Teddy Roosevelt. He went down in 1906. He was the first president to leave the United States. Went down to the thing. He wanted to see it himself. And there's Stevens and Roosevelt, and Stevens, Roosevelt, and Roosevelt's wife, I think, there on the little rail car, all in white. There's some of the rail cars. This is one of the breakwaters that they built. They had double tracks. The train would go out on one, it would empty, it would come back on the other one. And at some periods of time, they had a train going out there like every 5 minutes dumping. They built long breakwaters at both ends of the canal. They had lots of problems, lots of landslides, particularly in the area where they were digging through the Continental Divide at Culebras. And it got bigger and bigger. The original design was they were just going to dig a narrow trench straight down. What they found was that the soil and the geology here was such that the walls kept slumping. They had to go wider and wider and reduce the angle of the slope. And they had a constant problem there. Ultimately, they got down to the level of what would be the lake, and we were able to use dredges. And they still had problems with landslides. The canal opened in 1914, and the following year, in 1915, there was a landslide at this place that closed the canal for 7 months. People always say, has the canal ever been closed? That first year, after just about a year, it was closed for 7 months. But that Culebras was a big deal. These guys are drilling down and making holes in ground, going down about 20 feet. They would then put dynamite in, blast. Twice a day they would have blasts going off, and then the big shovels would come in and dig out what had been blasted. Notice here the blast men, these are all blacks. The majority of the people working on the U.S. project were from the Caribbean islands, particularly Jamaica and Barbados. Talk about them a little bit. These are men coming in from Barbados. Thousands came in. At one point in time, there were over 60,000 people working on the canal. These men are Europeans, whites, but again, basic low-level workers. In point of fact, there were 3 different levels of workers on the canal. Some workers were paid in gold, some people were paid in silver, so there was that distinction. Almost all blacks were silver workers. Almost all European, Southern European workers from Spain and Italy and Greece were silver workers. All the skilled workers, including some blacks, were gold workers. Some of the blacks eventually became engineers on the trains or running the big steam shovels. And that happened because there was a strike, and the steam shovel operators went out on strike, and all of them were fired. And their firemen, who in some cases were blacks, were able to move up and become the operators of the steam shovels. But relatively few blacks were gold workers, and there was quite a bit of difference between housing for gold workers and silver workers, etc. This is the Panama Canal headquarters up there on the hill. One of my colleagues at Fresno State was here in 1947 and took this picture. Here's another one of his shots from 1947. The building still is there. I took this one in February. I've been to Panama now. I've gone through the canal 4 times in the last 4 or 5 months, and so I took this one just a couple of weeks ago. Housing, again, the gold workers got pretty good housing. Married gold workers got fairly nice housing. Poor paid workers, silver workers, got very poor housing. In fact, many of the silver workers went off and built their own houses, little shacks, because they were better than what they were otherwise given. But many of the houses that go back to the canal construction period look like this. Lots of windows, overhanging roofs to give shade. And if you look carefully, particularly we're on the Pacific side, you may be able to spot a few houses around like this. These, I think, still exist. And I took this picture, last December. And so there are a few that you might be able to spot. The gold workers had very good facilities for recreation. They had YMCAs, swimming pools, bowling alleys. That was not the case for silver workers. And in the company stores, silver workers had one window that they could go to, and the gold workers went to another window. Post office, things like that, were all segregated. At the time of the French project, nobody knew about the relationship between mosquitoes and malaria and yellow fever, but by the time of the U.S. project, the work that was done by Walter Reed and his staff in Cuba at the end of the Spanish-American War, they had figured out how to cut down the problems of malaria and mosquitoes. A man by the name of William Gorgas was appointed the medical officer, and he stayed through the entire project, all the way through 1914. There's Gorgas. And He led a campaign to drain the swamps, to put water or oil on any standing water, screens on windows, and things like that. One of the stories is that when he first arrived in Panama, he went up to the guy that was the supply master and said, "This is what I need to be able to solve the health problem." And the guy said, "No, this is impossible. You'll probably only save one life." And according to the story, Gorgas said, "Well, yeah, but what if it's your life?" He got what he needed. So deaths dropped. The French in just a couple of years had 22,000 deaths. The United States had only about 5,000 deaths, most of them from accidents, particularly explosions. There was one explosion one time that killed 27 men that went off prematurely. So relatively few deaths in the United States project from the tropical diseases. Here's spraying water, putting oil on standing water. Here, men going around, they're going to put screens on windows and clean the streets. Notice the guy right there with his broom. They're cleaning the streets. They're trying to improve sanitation. Roosevelt appointed a man by the name of Goethals to head the project. And so he's there for the next, literally, I think, 8 years. There's Goethals again. He was well experienced in the Corps of Engineers in building canals on the Ohio River and other rivers in the American Midwest. He designed the project into 3 sections. One to build the locks at the Gatun, where we'll start, the center cut through the Culebras area, and then the Miraflores and San Pedro locks on the Pacific side. These are pictures from the canal construction. We'll go through these very quickly. And we're going to come back to the Panama Canal tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll be previewing what we're going to see as we go through the locks. And I'll also talk about the new construction in tomorrow. But I've got about 10 minutes left, and very quickly I want to talk a bit about Cartagena. That's our next stop. And many of you will at least be going around a little bit in Cartagena. I mentioned that Balboa participated in an expedition around 1508, 1509. The first real successful attempt to build or to have a town here was actually in 1533. That first project in 08, 09, and 1500s was a failure. But in 1533, a town was established where Cartagena is, and King Philip II named it a city or a town, Ciudad, which was making it the important port. For ships coming from Spain, they would come across the Atlantic through the Caribbean, and their first stop was Cartagena. Then from Cartagena, they would go to one of the Panama ports like Puerto Bello, and then from there they would go to Havana, and then they would go back to Spain. But this is their first stop coming over. It was repeatedly attacked by pirates, by the French, by the English, by the French, the English. And if you're careful, if you walk around your guide, if you're walking around the downtown, you may see that sign. There is a house there that supposedly Sir Francis Drake lived in for almost a year in 1586. The Spanish crown then authorized a series of forts. The Old Town area is surrounded by forts. There's where Cartagena is. And on this view, we're going to be docked right there, what they call the cruise terminal. The Old Town is over there, upper left. The area right below where it says Old Town is what is called Boca Grande. And Boca Grande was basically a sandbar out along the bay. This is a picture I took in 1972. The first time I was there was almost 50 years ago, August of 72. And we're looking off towards the Old Town. Here at the bottom of the picture there is the San Felipe Fortress, and I think if you're on the included tour, you will at least go past there and get out and look at it a little bit. There's the San Felipe Fortress from down on the ground. That's looking out towards Boca Grande, this old sandbar, 1972. There were only a couple high-rise buildings out there. There it is in 2015, and there's 2019. Lots of condos and hotels and things like that out on Boca Grande. This is the old entrance through the fort, through the walls of the old town, 1972. And this is in the downtown area, I think last year. That's called the Bolivar Square. Bolivar was the leader of their independence, and this is Bolivar in the main downtown plaza, right at the center of Old Town. The cathedral is there. The Inquisition building is there. You may walk around there. And I think at least some of the tours will do some walking around downtown. I love to walk in downtown Cartagena. We have a lecture coming up this afternoon on the shore excursions, and you'll get more info. I love this church. This is the Church of San Pedro Claver. He was a Jesuit who nursed and tended to the slaves. The slaves would arrive here from Spain or from Africa, and he would take care of them, and he was noted and became a saint. He's one of Colombia's saints. The church adjacent to where he lived, the monastery where he lived, it contains his remains. People love to say, I was near a saint. If you go to like Santiago Compostela in Spain, they supposedly have St. James's hand. Well, in this case, you don't have to see the hand of St. James. You can see this guy. He is underneath the altar, and that is his body underneath the altar. It's one of the few places where you can actually see a saint. And leaving the church, this lady is always asking for donations to help support the church. But this is downtown streets. I love downtown. And as a cultural geographer, one of the things that I love is buildings and architecture, things of that nature, but details. I love the doors, the doorways. As you walk around, pay attention to the doors. I love the door knockers. Door knockers are just absolutely great. And what I'm always doing is taking pictures of door knockers as I walk around downtown Cartagena. Where the cruise terminal is, where you get on the bus to go off on the various shore excursions, there is a little menagerie, and it's worth stopping there. There's obviously shops. You got to have a shop. But there's also a menagerie, usually with parrots and a few other birds, flamingos, things like that. To me, I love Cartagena. I've enjoyed going there every time in the last 10 years and then 50 years ago. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about the same lecture, but part 2 will deal with what we're going to see as we go through the canal and also the new locks, the new construction. I hope to see you then.